Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we love digging through those long regulatory filings, and today we've got a fascinating one all about a company called Sable Offshore Corp.
Oh, this is a good one.
So, to get started, can you give us a quick overview of, what is this company? What makes their story so interesting?
Yeah, so Sable Offshore Corp, they're in the offshore oil and gas business, but their story, it's kind of like a corporate makeover, you know?
A makeover, how so?
Well, they actually started back in 2021 as this thing called a blank check company.
Blank check company.
Yeah, they were called Flame Acquisition Corp at the time, and basically they didn't have any actual business operations. They went public with the sole purpose of finding a company to buy, to acquire.
So they were just kind of like an empty shell waiting to be filled.
Exactly. It's like imagine going public, raising all this money without even knowing what you're going to do with it yet.
Wow, that's pretty wild. So, what happened? What did they end up doing with all that cash?
Well, in November 2022, they found their target, a privately held oil and gas company, also called Sable Offshore Corp.
Huh.
And this acquisition, it finally closed in February 2024, and it totally transformed them overnight. They even changed their name officially to Sable Offshore Corp to kind of solidify this new identity.
Okay, so no more blank check, no more empty shell.
Mhm.
What do they actually get in this acquisition?
So they acquired these significant assets all off the coast of California. We're talking 3 offshore platforms. They're called Hondo, Heritage, and Harmony, and they sit on 16 federal leases.
16.
Yeah, and that covers something like roughly 76,000 acres. And these platforms already have 112 existing wells, but get this, there's the potential for 102 more.
So they're not messing around, huh? This is a pretty substantial operation.
Oh, yeah, especially when you consider, we're talking about California, which is not exactly known for being, well, friendly to the oil and gas industry.
California's got those really strict environmental regulations, right? So how does a company like Sable even operate in an environment like that?
Well, and this is where things get even more interesting, okay? Those platforms that I mentioned, they've actually been shut down, completely shut down since 2015.
Whoa, why? What happened?
It all goes back to this pipeline incident. They call it Line 901. This pipeline, it was operated by a different company at the time, Plains All American Pipeline, and it suffered a corrosion-related failure.
The corrosion.
Yeah, and that led to, well, a major oil spill.
An oil spill off the coast of California.
Yeah, you can imagine how that went over. That's why California is extra cautious now, understandably.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's stopping Sable from just, going in there, fixing the pipeline and restarting production?
It's not that simple. The 2015 spill triggered this whole wave of legal actions, investigations, lawsuits, the whole 9 yards. And that resulted in what's called a consent decree.
A consent decree?
Yeah, so this decree outlines very specific conditions that Sable has to meet before they can even think about restarting those platforms. We're talking about inspections, repairs, obviously, safety upgrades, you name it. They even have to do environmental remediation and provide compensation for those affected by the spill.
So they're not just inheriting these assets, they're inheriting a whole mess to clean up.
Yeah, literally and figuratively. It's a huge undertaking.
So who are the key players that Sable has to win over to get this restart going?
Well, there are a lot of agencies involved, but if you had to pick one with the most power, it would have to be the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSE for short.
BSE.
Yeah, they're the ones who ultimately determine if Sable's operations meet all those safety and environmental standards.
Okay, so BSE is like the gatekeeper, and they're focused on safety first.
Exactly, and they have a lot of power.
Like what kind of power?
Well, just think about this. BSE's been cracking down on what are called decommissioning obligations. That's basically what happens when an offshore platform reaches the end of its life, how you safely remove it and clean up the site.
Right, makes sense.
But BSE has made it very clear that they're going to enforce these obligations even on companies like Sable who acquired existing assets. So that means Sable could be held accountable for past issues related to those platforms, potentially adding significant costs and delays to their plans.
Wow, so they really inherited a lot more than they bargained for.
It seems that way, yeah. And all of this is happening with this, ticking clock.
A ticking clock, what do you mean?
There's a deadline. Sable has to restart production by January 1st, 2026. If they don't meet that deadline, the previous owner can actually take back all those assets.
Without any compensation?
Without any compensation. Talk about pressure.
Wow, that's a pretty high stakes game they're
Yeah.
playing. So they've got to contend with federal regulations, they've got to clean up this past mess, and they're racing against the clock. Anything else?
Oh, and don't forget, we're talking about California.
Right. Right.
The state has its own set of very, demanding environmental regulations on top of all the federal stuff.
Oh boy. So even if they get the green light from, BSD, they still have to deal with California's specific requirements.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
So what are some of the things that California is going to be looking at?
Well, think about it like this. California has very strict rules about how new oil and gas fields are developed. They control things like the spacing of wells, how they're operated. They even have all these measures to prevent wasting natural gas. So even the smallest details of Sable's operations could be scrutinized.
So they're under a microscope.
Pretty much. And it all ties into these broader concerns about, climate change and the push for cleaner energy.
Right, because oil and gas production, it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly. And this is where President Biden's global methane pledge comes into play. Remember that.
Yeah, the goal is to reduce methane emissions, right?
Yeah, it's a global effort. Over 100 countries have signed on, and it puts a lot of pressure on companies like Sable to minimize their methane leaks. They have a really small margin for error here.
So on top of everything else, they have this added pressure to be environmentally responsible.
And then there's the Inflation Reduction Act. Remember that one, too?
Yeah, that was a big deal.
It introduced this methane emissions charge that kicks in starting in 2024. Basically, if you exceed certain limits for methane emissions, you have to pay a fee, a pretty hefty fee. It starts at $900 per ton of methane.
Whoa, so that's a real financial incentive to keep those emissions in check.
It is. So Sable's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can invest in all this expensive methane leak detection and mitigation technology, or they can risk facing these huge penalties. It's a tough choice.
So they're really walking this tightrope between, financial risks and environmental responsibility.
Yeah, and that's what makes their story so fascinating to me. It's like, this one company, Sable Offshore Corp, is at the intersection of all these major forces.
What do you mean?
Well, you've got this legacy of a past environmental disaster, right? And then you've got this incredibly complex web of federal and state regulations, plus this race against time. And on top of all that, you've got this global push for cleaner energy. It's like watching a high stakes drama unfold in real time.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's not just about drilling for oil and making profits. It's about all these other factors that are influencing the industry.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the financial risks yet.
Right. Let's get into that next. What are some of the financial challenges that Sable's facing?
Well, for starters, they're not generating any revenue right now.
None.
Those platforms are shut down, remember? So they're relying on their existing cash reserves, and there's a good chance they're going to need to raise even more capital to make all of this happen.
And raising capital for a company with no revenue, that can't be easy.
It's definitely a challenge. Investors are going to be cautious.
So what are some of the things that Sable's doing to manage their financial risk?
Yeah.
You mentioned hedging earlier. Can you explain what that is and how it might help them?
Yeah. So hedging, it's basically like, imagine you could lock in today's price for something you're going to sell in the future.
Okay.
So in Sable's case, they could use these things called commodity derivative contracts to try and secure a fixed price for their oil and natural gas production, once they get back up and running.
So it's like they're trying to protect themselves from the risk of oil prices dropping.
Exactly. Because the global oil market, it's notoriously unpredictable.
Right. There are so many factors that could affect those prices.
Exactly. You've got global demand, geopolitical events, you name it. Even with hedging, there's always a chance that prices could move against them.
So it's not a foolproof solution?
Definitely not. And Sable acknowledges that in their filing. They even say that hedging can sometimes backfire and actually lead to losses if their predictions are off.
It's like a calculated gamble.
Pretty much. And it's just one part of their overall financial strategy. If their cash reserves run out, they're going to need to convince investors to give them more money. And that's going to depend on a lot of things.
Like what?
Like their ability to convince those investors that they can actually get those platforms restarted, that they can comply with all those regulations, and most importantly, that they can manage those environmental hurdles we talked about.
Right, because investors are going to want to see that they're taking those environmental concerns seriously.
Absolutely. It's not just about promising profits anymore. It's about showing that you can operate responsibly and sustainably. And that brings us to the people in charge, the leadership at Sable.
Okay, so who are the key players here?
Well, the CEO is James C. Flores. He's got a long history in the oil and gas industry, like decades of experience.
Okay, so he's a veteran.
Yeah, he's led companies through good times and bad times, booms, busts, you name it. And what's interesting is that he's also a member of the National Petroleum Council, which advises the U.S. government on energy policy.
So he's got connections, he's got experience. Sounds like he's the right guy for a tough job.
It seems that way, yeah. And his son, Jay Caldwell Flores, he's the company's president. He might not have the same, decades of experience as his father, but he's been involved in all sorts of different aspects of the industry: acquisitions, consolidations, optimizing upstream opportunities. He brings a fresh perspective to the table.
So it's like a blend of experience and fresh ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And then, beyond just the leadership, Sable's filing really emphasizes their commitment to things like safety, training, diversity, and inclusion. They talk about all these initiatives they have in place, like employee training, contractor management, risk assessments, hazard identification, incident reporting, even investigations. It seems like they're really trying to create this culture of safety and accountability at every level.
So it's like they're not just focused on the bottom line. They're trying to be a responsible corporate citizen.
Right. And it makes sense from a business perspective, too. Investors are paying more attention to these things now. They call them ESG factors: environmental, social, and governance. And companies that can demonstrate their commitment to these principles, they're often seen as less risky investments.
So it's like being good can actually be good for business.
It certainly can be, and it's refreshing to see, especially in an industry that, hasn't always had the best reputation in this area.
Right, right. Okay, so we've talked about regulations, financial strategies, and the people involved. What else can we glean from this SEC filing about, what Sable's actually doing, like their operations?
Well, let's take a closer look at those California assets, those three offshore platforms: Hondo, Heritage, and Harmony. They're kind of the heart of Sable's operations, and each one plays a crucial role in the whole production process.
So tell me more about how these platforms actually work. Like, how do they get the oil and gas out of the ground?
Well, they're all interconnected. They're designed to extract the oil and gas from those offshore fields. And each platform has numerous wells and what are called permanent drilling systems. That means they have the infrastructure in place to drill new wells and expand production if they need to.
So it's a pretty massive operation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But it's also a very complex operation. There are a lot of things that could go wrong.
Like what?
Well, oil and gas production, it's inherently risky. Sable even acknowledges this in their filing. They talk about the possibility of encountering unexpected geological formations, having to deal with the specific composition of the oil and gas itself, and then there's always the potential for human error or equipment malfunctions. Any of those things could impact their costs and their timelines.
Yeah, it sounds like a constant battle against like the elements and the technology itself.
It is, and then there's the issue of transporting those resources once they're extracted. We know that Line 901, that pipeline that caused the shutdown, is a critical piece of the puzzle.
Right, that pipeline that had the corrosion problem back in 2015. So
Yeah.
what are they doing to address that?
Well, restarting that pipeline, it's a huge undertaking. It's likely that the consent decree has very specific requirements related to Line 901. They're probably going to have to do a bunch of inspections, repairs, maybe even upgrades to meet modern safety standards. It's not just a matter of fighting a switch.
It sounds like a major infrastructure project.
Yeah, for sure. And all of that adds up, both in terms of time and money. And they'll probably need additional permits and approvals, which just adds another layer of bureaucracy to the whole process.
So it's a long road ahead of them.
It is. But let's assume for a minute that they get everything up and running right. The platforms are working, the pipeline is fixed, the oil and gas are flowing.
Okay, what happens next? Where does it all go?
Well, it goes to their onshore processing facility. This facility is located in Goleta, California, and it's designed to handle everything that's transported from those platforms. They separate the oil, the natural gas, and the water. They treat the water and prepare the oil and gas for sale.
So it's the final step before those products hit the market. Are there any potential issues there at the facility?
Well, their filing mentions that the facility has additional capacity for development. That suggests that they might need to invest in some upgrades or expansions to handle the influx of oil and gas if everything goes according to plan.
So more potential costs, more regulatory hurdles.
It never ends. And speaking of selling those products, here's another interesting tidbit from their filing. Sable currently has no commitments to deliver a fixed amount of oil or natural gas under any existing sales contracts.
Wait, so even if they get everything up and running, they don't have guaranteed buyers?
That's right. They're not locked into any prices that were negotiated before the restart, so they'll be selling at prevailing market prices once they're back online. It's a risk, but it also gives them flexibility.
Yeah, I guess it could work out in their favor if prices are high. But it could also backfire if prices drop.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bigger picture, the global energy landscape. Things are changing rapidly.
Right.
Well, you've got new technologies emerging, you've got shifting priorities, and of course you've got this ever-present concern about climate change. It's all putting pressure on traditional oil and gas companies to adapt.
So Sable's not just competing with other oil and gas companies. They're competing with, like, the changing tides of the energy industry itself.
Exactly. The transition to cleaner energy sources, it's gaining momentum globally, driven by those concerns about climate change and the need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And that's influencing investor behavior, it's impacting government policies, it's really changing the game for companies like Sable.
And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because the Inflation Reduction Act, which penalizes them for methane emissions, it's also the same law that's fueling the growth of those renewable energy alternatives.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex situation, full of contradictions and uncertainties. It makes you wonder about Sable's long-term prospects.
Mhm.
Can they really navigate these shifting tides, or will they be swept away by the currents of change? It's a question worth considering.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about regulatory hurdles, financial strategies, the technical aspects of their operations, and now this broader context of a changing energy landscape. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but it's all important. I think the key takeaway here is that this isn't just a story about one company. It's really a microcosm of the challenges and opportunities facing the entire oil and gas industry.
Right, because they're not the only ones dealing with these issues.
Exactly. It touches on all these complex questions about environmental protection, economic development, and the global shift towards cleaner energy sources. It's a story that has implications for all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the choices we make today, they have these ripple effects.
Yeah.
They affect the future, both locally and globally. And Sable's fate, it's still uncertain, but the questions that their story raises, those are questions we all need to be thinking about.
I agree. And before we move on, there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to explore, something that's going to add another layer of complexity to Sable's story. Their past.
You mean like the aftermath of that 2015 oil spill and all the legal battles that followed?
Exactly. Because that incident, it's not just a distant memory. It's a legal and regulatory saga that continues to this day, and it's going to have a big impact on Sable's future.
So let's delve into that next. What happened after that spill, and how is it still affecting Sable today?
Well, it's a complicated story, but to understand the full scope of what Sable's up against, we need to go back to the beginning and see how this whole thing unfolded. Remember, that pipeline failure, it wasn't just a technical mishap, it triggered a whole chain of events with lasting consequences.
Okay, so let's rewind the tape and take a closer look at the legacy of that 2015 spill.
So after that spill, it was a huge mess for the company that was responsible at the time, Plains All-American Pipeline.
Yeah, I bet. Oil spill in California, not a good look.
No, not at all. And they faced all these legal actions. Regulatory investigations, lawsuits, everything. People were angry, businesses were affected, government agencies got involved. Everyone was seeking compensation for the damages.
Makes sense. So how does that connect to Sable? I mean, they weren't the ones who owned the pipeline back then.
Right, but that's where the consent decree comes into play. That document, it basically dictates what Sable has to do before they can even think about restarting those platforms.
So it's like a roadmap for cleaning up the mess, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. It outlines all these steps they have to take to address the legacy of that spill.
So what kind of stuff are we talking about here?
Well, it probably includes things like stringent requirements for pipeline inspections, repairs, safety upgrades, obviously, environmental remediation, making sure the affected areas are cleaned up, and of course, compensation for those who are impacted by the spill.
So they're not just dealing with the technical challenges of restarting those platforms, they're also dealing with the legal and environmental consequences of this past failure.
It's a lot to handle.
And consequences can be costly,
Yeah.
right? I think I remember reading something about a recent settlement agreement related to those pipelines.
Yeah, just last month, Sable actually reached a settlement with a group of plaintiffs who had filed claims related to the pipelines.
Okay, so what were those claims about?
Well, they involved various issues, things like impacts on the pipelines, right-of-way, stuff like that. It seems like the fallout from that 2015 incident, it's still ongoing.
So even years later, they're still dealing with legal challenges stemming from that spill. What did the settlement actually involve?
Well, as part of the agreement, Sable's going to have to establish what's called a qualified settlement fund and deposit a pretty hefty sum of money. 35 million.
$35 million.
That's a big chunk of change, especially for a company that's, not generating any revenue right now.
That's a good point. It just shows you how expensive it can be to resolve these legal issues, not to mention the cost of complying with the consent decree itself.
It's definitely adding up.
So realistically, do you think Sable can overcome all of this? I mean, it sounds like they're facing an uphill battle.
Honestly, it's tough to say. They're dealing with this perfect storm of challenges. Technical challenges, regulatory hurdles, financial constraints, environmental concerns, and now all these legal battles. It's a lot for any company to handle.
So it's a high-stakes gamble, with a lot riding on their ability to navigate this incredibly complex landscape, come up with the money they need, and execute their plans flawlessly.
Yeah, and it's not just about profits and losses. It's a story that touches on these bigger issues, these questions about how we balance economic interests with environmental protection, the responsibility of companies to operate ethically and sustainably, and the long-term consequences of our energy choices.
It's a good reminder that we're all connected to this story in some way, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. What happens with Sable and with offshore oil and gas development in general, it has implications for all of us.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from a blank check company to oil spills, legal battles, and the future of energy. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it has. And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to this story, so many layers to peel back.
And hopefully our listeners will be inspired to do some digging of their own. We've tried to provide them with the key information and insights they need to form their own opinions and continue exploring this topic.
Exactly. We always encourage our listeners to go beyond just what we talk about here. Read the source materials, ask your own questions, and engage in those informed discussions about the future of energy and our collective responsibility to protect the planet.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of Sable Offshore Corp.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating one, that's for sure.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and until next time, keep diving.
So like I was saying, that pipeline failure back in 2015, it wasn't just a technical problem. It caused a whole chain reaction, legally, environmentally, you name it.
Yeah, it's amazing how one incident can have such far-reaching consequences.
Right. And for the company that was operating the pipeline at the time, Plains All American Pipeline, it was a disaster.
Yeah, an oil spill off the coast of California, that's got to be a PR nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. And they faced all sorts of legal actions, lawsuits from individuals, businesses, even government agencies. Everyone was seeking compensation for the damages caused by that spill.
So it sounds like they were hit from all sides.
Yeah, and that's where the consent decree comes in. That's the document that Sable inherited when they acquired those assets.
Right, that roadmap for cleaning up the mess.
Exactly. It outlines all the steps that Sable has to take to address the legacy of that spill, and it's pretty comprehensive.
So what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, it likely includes things like really strict requirements for pipeline inspections, repairs, safety upgrades, making sure everything is up to code. And then there's the environmental remediation, making sure that the affected areas are properly cleaned up. And of course, there's the compensation for those who were impacted by the spill.
So it's not just about getting those platforms back online. It's about making things right, addressing the harm that was done.
Exactly. It adds a whole other layer of complexity and cost to Sable's plans.
And speaking of costs, I remember we were talking about a recent settlement agreement related to those pipelines.
Oh, yeah. Just last month, Sable reached a settlement with a group of plaintiffs who had filed claims related to the pipelines.
Okay, so what were those claims about?
They involved a bunch of different issues, things like impacts on the pipelines right of way, stuff like that. It seems like the fallout from that 2015 incident, it just keeps going.
So even after all these years, they're still dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, and it's costing them money. As part of that settlement agreement, Sable has to establish what's called a qualified settlement fund and deposit $35 million into it.
$35 million? That's a lot of money. Especially for a company that's not generating any revenue right now.
It is. It's a significant chunk of their resources. It just goes to show you how expensive it can be to resolve these kinds of legal issues, not to mention the cost of complying with the consent decree itself.
So with all of these challenges, all these obstacles in their path, do you think Sable can actually pull this off?
It's a tough question. I mean, they're facing so much. Technical challenges, regulatory hurdles, financial constraints, environmental concerns, legal battles. It's a lot for any company to handle.
It's like they're trying to climb Mount Everest, but they're starting at the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's a really risky endeavor, and there's no guarantee of success.
But I guess that's what makes their story so compelling, right? It's a high-stakes drama with real-world implications.
Absolutely. It's a story about risk, responsibility, and the future of energy. It's a story that touches on all these big questions about how we balance economic development with environmental protection, the role of government regulation, and the choices we make as a society.
Yeah, it's bigger than just one company. It's about all of us.
And that's why it's so important to talk about these issues, to understand the complexities, and to engage in these informed discussions about the path forward.
We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners a starting point for their own explorations.
Yeah, we always encourage our listeners to dig deeper, read the source materials, ask their own questions, and form their own opinions.
Well said. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this episode of The Deep Dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from blank check companies to oil spills, legal battles, and the future of energy. It's been quite a journey.
It has. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Sable Offshore Corp.
And until next time, keep diving.